It's no secret Warhammer 40K has to be my favorite franchise right now. We already mentioned that in our last 40K video essay where we talked about my pile of shame. However, this time we aren't going to be talking about miniatures. Instead, we're going to be talking about 40K and another thing I love, video games. A form of media GW hasn't only been making for a while, but also seems to be doubling down on since 40K's recent popularity spike. Even back when 40K was more niche, they put out tons of games, and since then, they've put out over 50 games for 40K alone. And that's not including crossovers with other games like Call of Duty, World of Tanks, and Power Wash Simulator. I know a few years ago we joked about 40K Fortnite, but every year that reality becomes more likely. From what I can tell, a big reason for this semi-niche franchise to have so many games is because unlike other game franchises, where only certain publishers and or developers have the rights to make games of it, GW kinda lets almost anyone make 40K games, as long as they are close to the source material. Granted, this explains why 40K games tend to be hit or miss on the quality control, from games that are laughably bad, games that are kinda mediocre or just okay, or a couple that are genuine classics in some of my favorite games period. Though, the positive to not being restricted to a single team of developers is unlike many franchises where they're usually restricted to one or a few types of genres, there's a good chance there's a 40K version of any type of game genre you're interested in. Like RTS games, there's the legendary Dawn of War series. Like card games, try games like Warpforge or Horus Heresy Legions. Want to try Civilization with a 40K skin? Gladius is your game. What about a Doom game with a 40K skin? Last year we got the amazing Bolt Gun game. Maybe you're more into third-person shooters. Space Marine's a great choice. Like co-op horde shooters? Try Darktide or Space Hulk Deathwing. Miss games like Castle Crashers or Twisted Metal? We got orc versions of both those games. By the Emperor, we can keep going. Baldur's Gate 3, Rogue Trader, XCOM, Chaos Gate to Mechanicus. VR games, Battle Sisters. Games with space battles, Battlefleet Gothic 1 and 2. Heck, we even had 40K chess with Regicide. Though technically I'm pretty sure even regular chess is canon in 40K. I wonder if TikTok is canon in 40K.
I need more bullets! I need more bullets!
The point is, 40K games may not always excel in quality, but make up for it in quantity. However, I'd be lying if I didn't say 40K games haven't been getting slightly better these last couple years. Even when I started getting into 40K, the games went from being rated in 50s to 60s, to these last few years seeing titles get closer to the 70s or even near 90s. Especially games like Mechanicus, Rogue Trader, Chaos Gate, and Bolt Gun. And hopefully that will continue with the most hyped game of the year in my opinion, and a sequel to one of my favorite games of all time, Space Marine 2. We've been waiting 13 years for a sequel to one of the best 40K games of all time in my opinion, and so far, it looks pretty promising. However, after this and a few other upcoming games like Speed Freaks and Mechanicus 2, the future for 40K games is kind of a mystery. So with this video, I want to start brainstorming some other potential ideas for new 40K games. As I've explained, there's a lot of freedom for what kind of 40K games we can make. And as GW starts to double down on the quality aspect, we have the opportunity to get some pretty ambitious titles. So, I'm gonna brainstorm / spitball 10 ideas I had, and you're welcome to either share what you like or dislike about any of these ideas, or even better, share some of your own ideas in the comments. Who knows, maybe some 40K game developers will stumble on this video and get some ideas for the next project. Also, because 40K lore is really deep and expansive, I do apologize in advance if I fumble on anything while describing these ideas. Even after all these years, I still feel like I'm learning new 40K lore every day, and sometimes struggle to keep it all in my noggin. Alright, I think I've yapped enough. Let's get started with our first idea.
40K games, 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 40
Because this is my wish list, I can't guarantee any of these games will happen in my lifetime. But I had to start with this one, because one game I absolutely can't believe we haven't gotten yet is any game with playable Custodes. Of the 50 or more 40k games we've gotten, not a single one has let us control arguably one of the strongest units in the Imperium, outside of maybe card games and some mods. These golden-plated banana boys are basically the Emperor's Secret Service, as they guard the Golden Throne and are so strong they put Space Marines to shame. A big reason we might have not seen them much is because they usually stay at the Imperial Palace. But, especially in the modern 40k setting, Custodes have started to leave the palace and become more active, between finding promising individuals, delivering new Primaris Marines to various chapters, and following visions from the Emperor himself. And the crazy thing is, unlike other factions such as Space Marines, Guard, or Orcs, you really only need one Custode to take on armies of XENOS, demons, and heretics. As much as I love games like Space Marine, Darktide, and Boltgun, I will admit they do stretch these characters' capabilities when it comes to how many enemies they can realistically face for the sake of having a video game, especially Boltgun, because as awesome as that game is, ain't no way one Sternguard veteran is able to take on multiple greater demons at once. However, with Custodes, you don't need to bend the lore to get that insane power fantasy, and because they're so strong, you could even hypothetically raise the stakes even further. Imagine how badass it would be to charge an army of Xenos or cultists with your Guardian Spear and just perform a string of combos as you stab and shoot your way through them with such destructive power and grace. As for gameplay, I could see something similar to Dynasty Warriors, as that series also has a single character mowing down whole armies, but I can also see a hack and slash game with deeper mechanics and more focus on styling on your opponent. The two games that immediately come to mind for inspiration have to be Devil May Cry 5 and Metal Gear Rising. Both these games had amazing combat and incredible attention to detail, especially with their boss fights. And 40k has plenty of boss material the Custode could face, like Hive Tyrants, Chaos Champions, an Orc War Boss, or if they want to continue bending the lore, go fully nuts and have the final boss be a Chaos Knight or even a Titan. I'm sure they accomplished that somewhere in the lore.
Nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
Now, playing as a Custode would feel pretty empowering, but what if we went the complete opposite direction and took all power away from the player? While we have plenty of 40k games that focus on the action or scale of Warhammer, most of them seem to lack an aspect many would consider a core part of 40k, the horror element. Make no mistake, 40k has gotta be one of the most terrifying and grimdark settings in fiction. There are countless horrors that await us in the stars, and the average person is likely to die early in their life, and that's being pretty lucky. Right now, my old-time favorite horror game has gotta be Alien Isolation. I just love how immersive and terrifying that game was, and have wished for an experience like that again for so long. And if any series could do that, I think 40k has the potential to make that a reality. Funny enough, Creative Assembly, the developers who made Alien Isolation, make the Total War Warhammer games, so they probably wouldn't need to jump through many hoops to make it happen. Imagine being either a lone guardsman that got separated from their squad, or worse, a regular civilian whose city was just invaded. You'd have to focus more on stealth and avoid being seen, as you're far too weak to go up against any of these intruders that are hunting you. And depending on which faction is hunting you, this could be very terrifying. For example, the Night Lords are genetically enhanced super soldiers that turn to chaos and love terrorizing and skinning anyone they come across. You'd have Raptor units jetpack hopping from rooftop to rooftop, scouting the area, or Terminators busting through walls in search of survivors. And they still barely hold a candle to how scary it would be if we had factions like the Drukhari hunting us. The Drukhari's horrifying units and technology, combined with them prioritizing taking people prisoner and inflicting pain and torture over simply killing them, would make them the perfect enemy for a survival horror game. Alternatively, we could aim for more of a Event Horizon or Dead Space style of story. Your ship's skeller fields go down while you're going through the warp, and now you have demonic entities linking into the ship. Now you have to survive as you traverse your ship, try to repair it, find a way out of the warp and get off. But regardless what direction they take, horror is a genre that 40K has embraced a lot in other forms of media like books and animations, and given how popular horror video games are in general, it feels like a no-brainer to have a horror-focused 40K game. So after talking about two games I'm surprised aren't a thing, let's take a step back and talk about one that technically is already a thing. Now, I know when it comes to remasters and even remakes, a lot of people have mixed opinions about that stuff. We have been getting a lot of them, and a lot of the people who don't like them have pretty valid reasons. A lot of times it does feel like a sort of easy cash grab, especially if it's for a game that only came out a few years ago. And usually they'll just do minor changes, like usually just a slight resolution bump, and they'll charge full price for a game that came out like 15 years ago. And sometimes these remasters actually end up looking worse than the original game. But sometimes, especially with these more complex remakes, remastering a game can actually have some benefits. You take this old game and you give it a fresh coat of paint, you give it a lot of additional much needed features to improve the experience, you can inspire a new generation, and you can basically extend its life cycle. And in my list of games that deserve a remaster, the one that always pops up in the top of my list is Star Wars Republic Commando, because it was fun but dated, and I feel like it would really thrive from some updates and some co-op. But after that, it's totally Dawn of War 1 and its expansions. Before Space Marine 2, lore YouTubers, or Astartes, the thing that was getting many people into Warhammer 40K was Relic Entertainment's 2004 RTS game, Dawn of War. Dawn of War was the first game I got when I got my first gaming PC, and to this day, it's still arguably the best strategy game I've ever played. Even now, this game is so content-rich, with a large number of maps, units, army customization, various game modes, and custom matches that can be played with players or bots, an enjoyable campaign, and some absolute fire expansions. Even now, this game still has a devoted fan base that still play it constantly, and has even made many mods to expand the game even further with less restrictions, more factions, more units, and even stuff the game kinda realistically can't handle. Trust me, I tried one of these mods and it bricked my laptop after a week. Since then, we had Dawn of War 2, which was also pretty good, but a vastly different style of game to 1, and Dawn of War 3, which we don't really talk about Dawn of War 3. However, because this game came out in 2004, despite it aging pretty well, it's still clearly dated, from awkward in-game cutscenes and graphics, the funky AI, to just the limitations of how many units can be on screen. Now that it's been 20 years since the original game, I feel people aren't just ready to go back to basics Dawn of War, but I feel the strategy crowd is just thirsty for more RTS games in general, and the industry has evolved a lot in 20 years, and could do a lot of things to make this remaster the definitive way to play Dawn of War. There are some obvious things this remaster could do, like bundle all the expansions into one package, raise the resolution and frame rate. However, they could also have a studio like Blur Studios remaster not just the cinematic cutscenes, but even the in-game cutscenes as well. You could add more factions like the mods did, such as the Tyranids or Grey Knights. They could raise a number of units on screen, or add more modes, maps, and missions. The sky's the limit here. Now returning to new 40K game ideas, This is an interesting one because the inspiration for this idea came from a game I personally haven't played, but have heard a lot about. This game's called Papers, Please, and from what I've heard and seen, you basically play as an immigration inspector at a border checkpoint, and have to determine whether each person is allowed to enter or not, with the only clues being their personalities and their documents. It was a puzzle game where your decisions had actual consequences, like accidentally letting someone in who turned out to be a terrorist, or someone you denied being unable to bring medicine back to their sick loved ones, or even dealing with secret organizations. It definitely seems like a unique and interesting game, but you're probably wondering, where's 40K play in all this? Well, my answer is simply the Inquisition. Being one of the most powerful organizations in the Imperium, these secret police are in charge of investigating any forms of corruption and dealing with all kinds of threats, both outside and within the Imperium. This includes XENOS, heretics, demons, riots, general disputes between factions, potential political corruption, managing troops and supplies, etc. And like Papers, Please, you'd be making all these decisions from the safety of your desk. However, instead of simply managing a border checkpoint, you'd be managing the Imperium from across the galaxy. I was listening to this fan-made audio story called Gavin Bob by Vox and the Void, and the part that made me think of this idea was the part where it talks about an Inquisitor that has a stack of finished and unfinished documents about various reports and disputes that require their attention. As an Inquisitor, it would be your job to go over each scenario and determine the best course of action, and like Papers, Please, your decisions could have serious consequences. From the technical side, this game wouldn't be too hard to make. It could be a simple visual novel style game where it mostly takes place in your Inquisitor's office with a stack of documents, maybe a servo skull, a hologram projector, and maybe a wax stamp for when you approve something. Nothing that's gonna brick people's PCs and require the latest graphics card. However, the real meat and potatoes of this game will be with the writing, because you could write an infinite number of scenarios for your Inquisitor to deal with. In 40K, the Inquisition plays a part in many stories where their involvement leads to either them becoming the hero, their actions getting them killed or assassinated, or them just dooming everybody. And given how much power the Inquisition has and how grim dark this franchise can get, your simple choices could lead to either something terrifying, hilarious, or both. How about I throw out some hypothetical scenarios we could face? Someone could accuse somebody of being a heretic, the accused could say the same thing about the accuser, and you have to research both their backgrounds to see who the true heretic is. How about the AdMech petitioning to tear down a hospital to build another factory to produce more weapons for the Guard? You might have to choose whether to send reinforcements to save a chapter of Space Marines being attacked by orcs, or to send those reinforcements to escort an important political figure across the sector. You could be interrogating a prisoner to uncover the location of a bomb that they planted in an Imperial church, or you could be told about some workers that keep showing up late to work, and you gotta decide their fate. Either turn them into a servitor, give them a public lashing, or send the Arbites to investigate the situation further. You choose to send the cops, and it turns out you uncovered a hidden chaos cult trying to summon demons. You might be asked permission to skip a ship's inspection so they can deliver food to a colony before they starve. You accept, but uh-oh, it turns out that ship's crew were part of a gene stealer cult tasked to infect the colony's food supply. Maybe you have to choose which Space Marine chapter to send to protect the city. Your choices are either the Salamanders, who value protecting civilians above all else, or the Marines Malevolent, who would rather use those civilians as human shields. You hear about the Tyranids invading a Forge world that was developing Titans. Do you send the Ordo Xenos, Death Watch, and the Guard to retake the planet? Or do you just blow it up with Exterminatus and lose that planet and its resources? These are just ideas off the top of my head and the tip of the iceberg. In the end of the day, this game would be only limited by the dev's imagination, and you'd get to choose how heroic or evil you want to be, with branching storylines, multiple endings, and a huge cast of unique scenarios. Another faction that I feel doesn't get enough attention, but would make an interesting game is the Officio Assassinorum, or simply the Imperium's Assassins. Admittedly, we did get these guys as playable characters in the recent Chaos Gate game, and that was cool, but it only scratched the surface of what these guys are capable of. These assassins consist of the Vindicare, which is your sniper, the Calidus being a shapeshifter, the Calexis, which is more of an anti-psyker assassin, and the Eversor, for just when you want everything dead. Now I will confess, out of all the ideas in this video, this is probably one of my least thought out ones, but mainly because I can't exactly put my finger on what specific type of game this should be. I would love to see a game where you utilize each assassin for various assassination or stealth missions that require different expertise. Some examples being the Vindicare using vantage points to take out targets from afar, using the Calidus to go undercover, using the Calexis to suppress powerful targets like Psykers, or the Eversor to clear out many targets or wipe out all witnesses. As for gameplay, however, my head's jumping to all kinds of different inspiration like Hitman, Splinter Cell, Dishonored, or even some kind of co-op game where each assassin is a playable class. But unlike other co-op 40k games that are more straightforward horde shooters, this would be a co-op game where you'd have to strategize and coordinate with your team. Or we can make it a single player game where you get to choose which assassin you take for each mission. Preferably, I'd like it to be some form of first or third person action game that involves platforming, levels with various routes, and randomized targets or even objectives for replay value. But at this point, I'm honestly throwing the ball in your guys' court to see if you can flesh this idea out any further than I can. At the end of the day, I just want to play a strategic action stealth game involving these assassins. For number 6, I'm actually gonna throw Tau fans a bone and say a sequel to the 2003 PS2 game Fire Warrior. Now, full transparency, I haven't played Fire Warrior, but I did basically watch all the cutscenes and story moments on YouTube. The story was something.
You will do as I order and enforce the truce.
I want it on record that I was made to do this against my better judgment.
But I can count on you not to disappoint.
I will do what needs to be done. I will attend the truce talks as you request. I guarantee that no one will be disappointed.
12 seconds later.
I am Kovash of the Vashya Sept. I come in peace.
Peace? There will be no peace. Only the embrace of chaos.
Yeah, I knew it. This was definitely one of those games that bent the lore for the sake of the game, because despite playing as a regular Tau Fire Warrior on his first day of the job, this dude took out multiple Space Marines, Demon Princes, and even a Greater Demon. But as far as the game is concerned, people's opinions seemed kinda mixed. Except for PlayStation outlets, they really wanted this game to be the Halo killer, but then Halo 2 came out a year later and kinda put it in its place. I also heard many complaints about the game's controls and it having a bunch of bugs and issues. Oh well, at least the cover goes hard. So why do I want a sequel to this game of all games? To be honest, I wasn't really interested in this idea until I saw concept art from Lion Sketch for a sort of Fire Warrior Remaster pitch, and I gotta say, after seeing these concept arts, it not only opened my eyes to the idea, but it really made me think about how much more the first game could have been. From what I could tell, the first game suffered from two main issues. The first issue was it trying to use outdated controls when games like Halo were offering more seamless control schemes. The second was treating this as a standard FPS. Throughout the game, you're just doing standard shootouts through various linear hallways, and most of the guns you use aren't even Tau weapons, but Imperium or Chaos weapons like bolters and las rifles. However, what makes the Tau interesting in my opinion isn't their basic strength, but their tactics and technology. If we were to get another Fire Warrior game, I'd love to see the game resemble some kind of combination of games like Titanfall 2 and more so Ghost Recon. Looking back at some of the concept art, I realized there is some intensity to versing enemies like Space Marines that could take you out with ease. So instead of just playing as an overpowered Tau warrior, you should have it more like Ghost Recon, where you could play as a Tau commander leading a squad of fire warriors and drones. You could still go in guns blazing if you're confident enough, or you can coordinate with your teammates, take a stealthy approach, synchronize your shots, and start picking off guardsmen and marines one by one and start performing hit and run ambush tactics. Your teammates could be AI that you could command, or maybe even throw in co-op. They also have plenty of technology that could spice up the gameplay. The Tau love using drones, so they could play a big part in the game. They could be like the drones in Ghost Recon, or even the one in Killzone Shadowfall. They could scout the area, mark targets, block shots, provide shield cover, or snipe enemies. There could be a mission where you need to use a stealth suit to sneak past enemies, or a vehicle section that requires you to use some of the Tau's hovercraft vehicles. Most of all, there could be missions that require the Tau to use their various mech suits. Like Titanfall 2, you could start off fighting on the ground before you have to get into a mech suit to do some large-scale mech combat. You could even have the game focus on Farsight and his Enclave, as those guys are probably the most badass Tau within the faction. You could even end some missions with epic boss fights. You could go face to face with ground bosses like Deathwatch squads or Ogryn, or hop into your mech and fight Dreadnoughts, Leman Russ tanks, Knights, or maybe even a Titan. Some of these fights might be difficult up close, so you and your team have to strategize and take them by surprise. Regardless, giving the game some modern controls and maybe focusing its inspiration more on games like Ghost Recon than Halo, I feel like that would make the sequel tailor more to this faction. Continuing the trend of 40K games starring XENOS, let's now talk about the Tyranids. A lot of people like the Tyranids. One of my best friends plays Tyranids, and you know what? I like them too. They make for a great faction to fight against. They're like an approaching storm you have to hold off or be swept up by. Though in most 40K stories, the Tyranids usually are the antagonists and not the stars of their story, mainly because they share one mindset with their hive mind, don't have many named characters, and their goal is usually just to eat everything. I want to see a game where they don't only get to be the main character faction, but also a game that highlights what I personally consider their most interesting trait, that being their biology and how they spread across the galaxy and evolve to deal with different threats. And the first game that comes to mind to turn to for inspiration would be Plague Inc. Basically, the premise was you'd get to create a pathogen and its specific traits, let it loose on the world, and basically try to evolve it enough to where it would infect and wipe out everyone on Earth before they could come up with a cure. It was a simple premise but had a lot of depth, because not only did you have to find ways for your disease to spread from country to country, but you had to evolve it to fight off vaccines or tailor it so it wasn't too lethal and killed everyone before you could spread it to the other regions. And this just focused on a single planet. What if our Tyranid game was like Plague Inc., but instead of a pathogen, we got to make our own hive fleet and spread it across the galaxy of Warhammer 40K, and we'd get to play as a mysterious hive mind as we send our Tyranids from planet to planet to collect biomass. Like the Inquisitor game, this game would offer a huge variety of scenarios and choices for the player. You would need to go from planet to planet and collect various amounts and types of biomass in order to create and upgrade many different types of Tyranids. You'd use them to fight off various enemies, be resistant to certain hazards, improve traversal, buff your other units, or to help assist in your collection of biomass. For example, some planets could have more forests, wildlife, or resources that provide more biomass. Other worlds could be fortress worlds like hive cities or forge worlds These would have less organic life besides the population, but invading these worlds could deal devastating blows to your enemy's resources, or maybe give you experience that would force you to adapt your units for more types of encounters. Say you enter a world being protected by the Imperial Guard. They have a bunch of trenches and tunnels, so you create a horde of little Ripper swarms to flood those areas and eat them up. They then start to call in Space Marines, start using flamethrowers or poisonous gas, and start shelling you with artillery and tanks. Then you'll have to spend more collected biomass to create stronger and more resilient Tyranids to adapt to these new threats. Maybe their fortress is in the middle of the ocean or a floating city. Maybe you should focus more on flying units or upgrading them to breathe underwater. Maybe you save up your biomass so you could spend it on more expensive units, like more hive ships to spread them out into other planets and fight in space battles, or destructive large units like Bile Titans or the Norm Emissary, or use Shadow of the Warp to cut off Psykers so they can't call for help or warp travel. But remember, the objective isn't to just defeat your enemy, but also to be able to collect enough biomass that the whole invasion is worth it. What if you're taking an Imperial world when they decide to send a ship to just exterminate the entire planet? Or you run into factions like Chaos Demons or Necrons that don't have any biomass for Tyranids to consume? Tyranids have hive fleets like Kronos that are specifically made to fight factions like Chaos, while other hive fleets collect biomass for both them and Kronos. Stuff like that would allow you to be able to take on more threats like Chaos, but now your resources are basically cut in half as you must share your biomass with various hive fleets. Maybe, instead of going for a straightforward invasion, you could send out scouting units like Lictors to sneak around the planet and learn more about it. Or you could try to infect a world and slowly but quietly turn its population into gene stealer cults. If left undetected, it'll grow enough to eventually overthrow their government and they could just hand you the planet without wasting many units or resources. Of course, you'd have to watch out for groups like Death Watch or the Inquisition that might uncover and dismantle these cults or develop new bioweapons to deal with your units. Other factions could also pose some unique challenges, like the Orcs might provide a lot of biomass that would make you stronger but could also match your numbers. It would take so much longer to clear out one planet of Orcs that your expansion would be slowed down and it would give other factions time to strengthen their defenses. Enemies like the Eldar would strike with few but powerful units, maybe take out a few of your powerful Tyranids and then disappear by teleporting into the webway. Or maybe you gotta make more ranged units because the Tau keep fighting you from a distance with their advanced weaponry. This game would require a lot of strategy, resource management, and adapting to new challenges. You won't get far if you stick to a single unit or playstyle, but as you grow and as you adapt to more things, you can make the Tyranids the biggest threat in the galaxy like we constantly hear about in the lore. Alright, we've talked about 2 games starring XENOS back to back. So I think it's about time we appease our GW overlords, quit talking about these filthy XENOS, and start talking about
Space Marines!
Given this is a 10 potential 40k games video and I'm a Space Marine simp, it was a matter of time before these guys would come up. What can I say? Sci-fi soldiers and advanced power armor is my favorite genre. Now Space Marine has got to be my personal favorite 40k game of all time. And Space Marine 2 looks like it's about to be just as good. Now, assuming this sequel is gonna wrap up Titus's story, I would like to see this franchise continue and maybe focus on another Space Marine chapter. I'd love to see my boys, the Black Templars, get a game. Now, obviously I'm a Black Templar player, so there is some bias in this, but I do believe they're one of the best chapters to base a game around. Besides the Ultramarines, they definitely seem to be one of the largest and most active chapters. Usually Space Marines are limited to 1,000 Marines unless they're going on a crusade, so the Templars basically said, okay, I guess we'll just go on an endless crusade to wipe out every heretic, XENOS, and demon. Not only are they spread out across the galaxy with untold numbers, but they've been involved in so many important events in 40K, including the War of the Beast, the Third War of Armageddon, and the Fall of Cadia. Honestly, I'd just love to see a video game adaptation of the 40K comic Damnation Crusade. It'd be a great introduction of the setting for newcomers, because like in the comic, you'd be starting your Space Marine career as just an initiate, but as you hop planet to planet, fighting all the Imperium's enemies, you'd start to rise the ranks and learn the military structure of the Marines. As far as gameplay goes, it would play similar to Space Marine 1 and 2, but you'd be on one internal crusade as you hop from planet to planet, taking on various factions like Eldar, Necrons, Chaos, Tau, Orcs, Tyranids, or more. I'd love them to do something like classic Battlefront 2's Galactic Conquest mode. You'd have this map of various planets you could take or defend, and as you earn progression, you could level up your character or other units, from standard Marines to unique classes. They could be like Terminators, Apothecaries, Chaplains, Sturgard Veterans, or they'd become more unique Templar units, like Sword Brethren, Castellans, or even the Emperor's Champion. I imagine the story mode will probably focus on a specific character, his squad mates, and their progression within the Black Templars. But you could also have an online crusade mode where, like in the Space Marine games, you can play and customize your own Marines into whatever chapter you want and go on your own personal crusade. You could play solo or with friends who will either team up with you or play as Chaos Space Marine factions and go against you like they did in the Galactic Conquest mode. Every time someone lands one of their ships on a planet, you could have both teams face off with limited lives and a few dozen Marines that can play as various classes. At the end of the match, whichever team wins gets the planet and gets bonus XP for their units and upgrades. We could even recycle the various maps for more straightforward PvP modes and reuse some of the various AI enemies like Orcs, Tyranids, or Necrons for Horde mode. This would be such a great evolution for the Space Marine series, and I'd definitely pick up a Space Marine Crusade game day one. For number 9, I'm gonna throw the Warhammer community a bone and talk about what's arguably the most requested 40K game. A Battlefront / Battlefield style multiplayer shooter, but set in Warhammer. Honestly, I'd be down for this too. I used to love large scale multiplayer shooters like Battlefield, the Battlefront games, or Big Team Battle and Halo. And Warhammer would be the perfect setting for a game like this, with all the large scale battles and units you could have. You could have the game set anywhere in the setting, but if we wanted to pick a particular event to set the game in, I'd definitely recommend the Siege of Vrax. The Siege of Vrax was mainly the Deathcore of Krieg versus Chaos Cultists, but it had other participating factions including the Grey Knights, Dark Angels, Alpha Legion, Chaos Demons, and more. Everyone would be starting off playing as a guardsman or a cultist and having large-scale battles over trenches and fields, using various weapons, tanks, walkers, demon engines, aircrafts, artillery, and more. In fact, we could even take a page from the Battlefront games and let you earn points from getting kills and doing objectives, and let you respawn as stronger units like Space Marines, Dreadnoughts, Knights, or even a Titan. Maybe even certain matches or game modes can have special events. During the middle of the match, the planet could have hazardous storms, artillery support, void ships could be firing at the ground, or if a losing team is losing too badly, the game could give them a special unit to turn the tide. Maybe Chaos gets to summon a Daemon Prince or a Greater Demon, or maybe even a Titan enters the field that the losing team can control. It would kind of be like what they did in Battlefield 1. In fact, I would have liked a studio like DICE to do a game like this, since all you'd have to do is just take Battlefield 1, slap a Warhammer skin over it, add a few mechanics from the Battlefront games, and just call it easy money. However, considering how DICE handled the last Battlefield game, maybe another studio should take a crack at it. Regardless of whoever does it though, as long as it has stable online, progression, plenty of modes and maps, and replayability, I bet this game would be a huge hit for the community. Finally, we're at the last game idea, and I think I saved a good one for number 10. Besides the Custodes, there's one other group that I feel is terribly underused in Warhammer games, despite being very used in the books, and that would have to be the Emperor's own sons, the Primarchs. The Emperor made 20 sons. The Emperor made 18 sons who were practically demigods, each having incredible strength and speed, most of them having unique abilities and weapons, most growing up to raise their own empires, and each having their gene seed DNA used to create Space Marine legions for each of them to lead as their sons. Hence why the Space Marines like to call each other brother a lot, like they're Hulk Hogan or something. And if you know even a little bit about Warhammer, you've probably heard of a little event called the Horus Heresy, where half the Primarchs turned traitor, took their legions and some Imperial forces, and waged a galactic-scale civil war. The Horus Heresy is pretty much the most famous and important event in all of 40K, which is saying a lot for this franchise. And the battles between brothers would be devastating and awe-inspiring. So the fact that these guys have never been playable in any other kind of game besides a tabletop blows my mind. And I do believe a fighting game would be a perfect format to play as these demigods and watch them beat the crap out of each other. If there's one thing the Warhammer community loves to get into heated debates over, besides female Custodes, it's which Primarchs are the best and the worst, which are loved and which are hated, and who can beat who. It's pretty much like those middle school debates you'd have with your friends, like who would win between Deadpool or Deathstroke, or Dante vs Kratos, and we can exploit that rivalry with a fighting game. Like imagine Imperial Fist and Iron Warrior fanboys having a heated debate over which Primarch is better. The Iron Warrior players like, Rogel Dorn is a boring Primarch, Purdy's way better, in which the Imperial Fist player responds, at least my Primarch is more competent and not a whiny bitch. Oh yeah? Ever heard of the Iron Cage? Oh, that's it, motherfucker. Let's go back to my place, play some Heresy fighters, and throw down. Each Primarch would have their own unique fighting styles, various weapons like swords, hammers, lightning claws, spears, bolters, chain axes, and so on, as well as unique abilities. Some of these abilities are more subtle, like Gilliman's logistical skills, while other Primarchs have crazy abilities, like Kurz and Sanguinius being able to see the future, Magnus being a Psyker, or Vulcan being a Perpetual who's just shy of being immortal. Obviously, for gameplay's sake, we don't want characters to be too OP, like Vulcan having infinite health or something, so their abilities during gameplay could be balanced, so they just tease their abilities from the lore, but are still unique enough to make every character feel distinct. For example, Vulcan, instead of having something OP like infinite health, maybe his health just heals a tiny bit every couple seconds over time. Or he's kinda like Jason from Mortal Kombat X, where after he's beaten, he comes back with like 15% health and yells, Vulcan lives! Conrad Kurz can see the future, so maybe he has a limited special ability where once during a match, he can auto-dodge your opponent's next 5 attacks. Mortarion could have a special ability where every couple of minutes, he can create a temporary toxic aura around himself that does chip damage to anybody near him. Or maybe Angron's damage increases the lower his health gets. There are many other cool gimmicks we could throw in as well. Every Space Marine Legion usually had a chapter master or a couple important named characters that were usually close to their Primarch. So we could do some kind of Mortal Kombat 1 style cameo system where you can call in somebody to either block or interrupt your opponent's attacks, or they can help you keep your combo going. Like imagine Horus is about to lunge at Rogel Dorn, so he calls in Sigismund to do an uppercut-like sword slash that knocks Horus into the air. Rogel Dorn then starts to juggle him with an insane combo, so Horus interrupts it by calling in Abaddon to sweep his legs or something. Funny enough, since Alfarius and Omegon are twins, their special ability can just be them being each other's cameos and basically being two characters in one. Imagine Rogal Dorn is kicking Omegon's ass to the point where he's like at 10% health left, so he calls in Alfarius, but instead of being a normal cameo where he would strike once and then leave, he runs into frame, drop kicks Rogal Dorn in the face while yelling, "I am Alfarius!" and then tags in for Omegon with a full health bar. I'd also love to see them interact with their environment like they do in games like Injustice or Guilty Gear, whether that be knocking each other out of the level into another stage or grabbing things or people from the environment and chucking them at each other. Like imagine if all the Space Marines are just fighting in the background when suddenly someone like Angron comes in and grabs like a Space Marine or a tank and chucks it at one of the other Primarchs. Now, I'm not the most knowledgeable and am more of a casual fighting game fan, so I know there are many people who probably go in a lot deeper into what this game should have when it comes to things like movesets, finishers, features, and balancing. But besides for the gameplay itself, one thing that I feel like would really give people a lot of hype for this game is a flushed out story mode. Like I said, the Horus Heresy is one of the most popular events in 40K history, so much so that it has over 60 books and its own tabletop game. However, because it's over 60 books, it can be pretty intimidating to try and read the series instead of just sticking to lore YouTubers. This would be a great way to adapt and summarize the story for both newcomers and hardcore fans. Throughout the Horus Heresy, each Primarch at least got a couple fights against other Primarchs. We can follow the events of the story in chronological order and play as each Primarch. I'd also love to see them do a more fleshed out version of the giant war level that they did in Tekken 8 story mode, where many characters got to fight swarms of regular enemies before then fighting each other. Like imagine you're playing as Sanguinius and you're cutting through hundreds of Chaos Space Marines and demons before you then have a cutscene trigger where Angron comes in to challenge you before it then transitions back to in-game where you two start to go at it in a fight. And there are so many epic fights in the Horus Heresy, like Leman Russ vs Magnus the Red, Fulgrim vs Ferrus Manus, Rogal Dorn vs Alfarius, Vulcan vs Conrad. Hell, Sanguinius basically had to go through 3 boss fights back to back, facing Carbonda, then Angron, and then finally Horus. And speaking of Horus, the story mode would have such an epic finale, having the final boss fight be a supercharged Horus, with you getting to finally play as the Emperor of Mankind and having this 3-stage cinematic boss fight. And imagine after you complete the campaign, you unlock the Emperor as a playable character. Now that would be an awesome reward. Speaking of playable characters, on top of Big E and the 18 Primarchs, there are plenty of ideas I have for more DLC fighters. We could have demon versions of some of these traitor Primarchs, like Angron or Mortarion for example. We could have 40k versions of Guilliman and the Lion, and other notable characters like Kabanda, Valdor, and Malkador. And even the 2 missing Primarchs can be playable as your own custom characters. I'm getting hyped just thinking about this game existing. And those are the 10 40k games I'd love to see become a reality someday. There were probably a couple other honorable mentions I had that I'd like to shout out, like a Total War Warhammer game but set in the 40k setting, a Surgeon Simulator style Apothecary game, or an official video game version of the tabletop besides Tabletop Simulator. But I think this video has gone on long enough, so we'll cut it here. Did any of these game ideas interest you? And what kind of Warhammer games would you guys like to see? Or do you just want to see Space Marines in Fortnite? I mean, they're already in Modern Warfare 3, so I guess that's basically the same thing. Alright, take care everyone.